In my experience, I've seen enough people claim that a cartoon is good just because it has representation for a certain group, and they don't look at anything beyond that. While it's important to do this so that every cartoon doesn't become the exact same, there can be certain situations where a cartoon is bad because of how it goes about representing a certain group. For my big example of this, I've decided to talk about El Tigre, which is a cartoon I placed in my top 10 worst Nicktoons list. To understand the full context, one must look at the state Nickelodeon was in back in 2007. It was around this point that the popularity of shows like SpongeBob and the Fairly OddParents were hitting their peak, and Nickelodeon was desperate to find cartoons that would be just as popular, for what I think are obvious reasons.
We've got to have money.
The mid to late 2000s were a time where Nickelodeon would give a show 1 or 2 seasons and then cancel it immediately if it didn't reach the success of The Sponge. And this led to a lot of bad and mediocre shows being made, as more and more creative control was being taken away from the creators. In the animation industry, you have to have decades of experience and make many popular shows in order to get the benefit of the doubt from networks. In animation, the simple act of making one season of a show can cost lots of effort and money, and for shows that the network has less faith in, it's almost a guarantee that the creator will have less and less control over the show, and this is especially true for Nickelodeon. With all these factors, it's no surprise that a high-concept superhero comedy taking place in a foreign country would need to prove its success to gain the trust of executives. And when the execution on the creative side is fundamentally wrong, this can make longevity even more of a challenge. El Tigre's creators are not completely the victim here, but how their show turned out isn't completely their fault either, and if a Nickelodeon show isn't made by one of the network's golden creators, it can't afford for any aspect to go wrong. El Tigre had many things done wrong, and it's not exactly clear which flaws are due to executive involvement and which ones were creative choices.
Yeah.
And so my goal was, how do I make it fun? How do I make it exciting? How do I make the audience feel like a kid when he walks into a toy store or a candy store and they get overwhelmed by all this stuff they want? How do I do that with my culture? Again, I'm a kid in Mexico and I admire Batman and I admire Spider-Man.
Yeah.
And I go, why can't I admire someone who under the mask looks like me?
The goal behind this cartoon is clearly innocent and noble, but going beyond that, the execution has to be done well to resonate with the network and ultimately with the audience. El Tigre's premise is executed in one of the worst ways imaginable. The premise of a kid with superpowers with a superhero dad and a supervillain grandfather is not a bad premise at all. In fact, it's a great premise. But because Manny seems to have no good guidance, and the best friend Frida always wants him to do the morally wrong action, many of the plot lines are predictable. In many cases, there's not a moral gray area portrayed by the show. There's an obviously good thing Manny can do, and an obviously bad thing Manny can do, and the bad thing is always seen as the cooler or more fun option. In fact, rewatching this show, I can see that the show is more formulaic than I remembered. It's not on the level of something like Scooby-Doo or Phineas and Ferb, but it is definitely a show that uses a template over and over. But with the 2 examples I just mentioned, the original template used was actually good. Because we have a morally bankrupt and misguided protagonist in a show about a struggle between good and evil, it shifts the main conflict from will he join his dad or grandfather to will he ever get off the path he's on right now. Manny seems to be like a character that's destined for evil that his dad is begging to change, and because most of the conflict comes from the same household, the tight-knit nature of things makes it uncomfortable to watch at times. It's like we're getting a glimpse at some family drama. Manny's moral compass has been established as being rather misguided, not just by his grandfather, but by the aforementioned Frida. You might have been told at one point in your life by your parents, teachers, whoever, that one of your friends was a bad influence on you. Someone needs to tell Manny that about Frida. She's a poorly conceived character just telling Manny to do stuff that always ends badly. If Frida's on screen, something stupid will happen, and that's the problem many people have when writing stories about good versus evil. For the message to get across, the concepts of good and evil usually have to be diluted to within an inch of their life, ultimately resulting in a simplistic view of the morals and stories you're trying to tell. The very first episode of the show is about Frida convincing Manny to take his dad's shoes that give him superpowers. And of course when they get damaged, the meat of the story is them trying to hide it from Manny's father. At the end it looks like Manny learns his lesson, but then in the last scene they do the same thing to his grandfather's sombrero that gives him his powers. But talking about the show more generally, what's the big picture? Why do all these complaints about the show even matter? Because these complaints are all the ones that can reasonably be attributed to concepts of the show and their execution, and they're ones that I can imagine being the creator's fault. Every other criticism I'm about to mention is something the creators most likely could not help. In the show El Tigre, which takes place in a fictional Mexican town, there is almost zero Spanish on any of the street signs, and very little of it, if any, is used in the actual show. Like, not even a word here and there. I know that this show is made for an English-speaking audience, but would it not help the atmosphere a bit to have it on street signs and things like that? Maybe a word here and there that most non-Spanish speakers know, like fiesta. Even the Looney Tunes gets more atmospheric with their Mexican character Speedy Gonzales. Take for example the song Queso Bandito. I was 10 years old when this short came out, and even back then, I was able to understand the Spanish words used in context, even with words I've never heard before.
Careful not to take a siesta, you will have no cheese for fiesta. Always chased by the federales, but they ate too many tamales.
I know that the creators of this show really wanted to make a mark for their people, and despite the personal gripes I have with this show about the ethics and the atmosphere, there are things done right, and I can see that it was a valiant effort.
El Tigre is about a boy who loves his grandfather and loves his father. His dad is a superhero, his grandpa's a supervillain, and he's got to figure out what he wants to do. Be good or evil, right? So take that back, break it down to my life. When I was growing up, my dad was an architect, so he was an artist, and I would go visit him in his office, and I would say, hey Dad, can you draw me a dinosaur? And he would be working on a house, turn around, draw me a perfect dinosaur, and go back to drawing the house. So I thought he had superpowers, and I thought he was a superhero because he was an artist, because he could draw. And then my grandfather, on the other hand, he was in the Mexican military. So whenever I would go to his office, the carpet was red, it was really dark. He was always on the phone, really hushed over. He had knives and guns everywhere. So I thought he was a supervillain.
And I can only help but think that the network prevented them from going as far as they wanted to. One of my favorite things about this show is the art style. It's something that's appealing to look at and sets the tone and atmosphere. The oranges and yellows of the sky really place you in a gritty, crime-filled atmosphere, and the character designs really do fit the tone and Mexican theme of the show. But when you go beyond that, not much else really does that. Since the creators of the show are Mexican, I'd expect more of their culture to be here, but I don't think it is. It takes a surface-level depiction of the Mexican culture, and that is sad. But I also don't think it could be helped. Jorge Gutierrez would later go on to direct the movie The Book of Life, and I imagine more of him is in that work than this one. But if the network is responsible for how watered down certain aspects of this show are, they're actually doing more damage than just damaging the reputation of the show itself. If Nickelodeon truly wanted to represent different cultures, doing it well should have been the mission, not trying to please everyone. During my research, I came across an article about Mexican media representation in Germany. While not everything applies one-to-one to this situation, I do think some core ideas can be gleaned from it. The less commonly a group of people is exposed to a certain culture, the more stereotyped and more warped the perception of it becomes. The logic goes like this. If a show about Mexican culture isn't successful, then why should we care about how we represent these people in the future? Nickelodeon admitting failure after only 2 seasons proves that they were not ready to let the creators fully embrace the culture they were representing. And considering how long it took for them to do it again, that does damage to cultural representation. Bad representation is worse than none, but if done especially badly, bad representation can lead to none. Fiction is as important as nonfiction, and if there's fewer representations of a culture, each piece represents a larger percentage of what's out there. The importance of cultural exposure in media cannot be understated. If only one culture is exposed to the masses in the media of a particular society, that society will feed off itself, and it will create a less informed public. There's an entire world out there, and when the media of the different parts of the world are made badly, it reflects poorly on how the publisher views that culture. Viacom may not have intended for this show to be received poorly, and to be honest, perceived opinion of this show is very divided. People like me who think the show is mildly bad contrast to the cult following this show still has a decade and a half later. But I think that this show had a lot riding on it that people didn't see. Viacom and Nickelodeon saw low ratings and thought that the cultural showcase was the problem. It wasn't. Networks rarely look inward, especially Nickelodeon. Talented creators like Jorge Gutierrez aren't the problem, the networks are. They hold the cultural representation in their hands, and unfortunately, it's up to the creators to make the best of the situation, to create a great image for the audience to latch onto. But with that said, thanks for watching, and have a good one.